Today, President Ramaphosa assumed office in mid-February, just over 100 days ago. It's become customary all over the world to reflect upon the first 100 days of someone's leadership. That's been done over the last couple of days by various analysts, including Mr. Ramaphosa himself. We all know the background to his assuming office. We know that he inherited a few big problems. He has to deal with the legacy of state capture, factionalism within the party. We also know that he has taken a very strong stance on various issues. We have seen the forced resignation of the board of ESCOM. We've seen the appointment of 5 special envoys to boost our economic reputation in the world. Many expectations. But in all honesty, 100 days is exactly that. It's only 100 days. One swallow does not make a summer. And the real question now could be, what about the future? Does he have the leadership attributes to steer the country and the economy in the direction we're all hoping for? To help us answer this question, I'm happy to welcome Dr. Morne Mostert. He is the director of the Institute for Futures Research and also an expert and a keen student of leadership issues. So Morne, let's look beyond the report card kind of thing, but rather let's have a look at Mr. Ramaphosa, his leadership attributes, and his ability to indeed take the country in the right direction. Perhaps I can kick off by asking you, why would someone want to be president? What drives people to want to become president or premier of a country?
I think it's a fascinating idea, and in fact, Mr. Ramaphosa has shown his interest in taking a lead throughout his entire life. So, in more than 20 years of doing work in leadership, I'm continuously asked, what does it mean to be a leader? And the best answer I've been able to come up with in 20 years is that a leader leads. And what I mean by that is that leadership, in a sense, is a philosophy of the world. It is the sense that you simply believe that things can and indeed should be done better, and that you're willing to take the responsibility to do so. And so that is, of course, the most noble interpretation of leadership, and in a certain sense we bestow upon Mr. Ramaphosa this idea that he believes that South Africa can be a better place, and he feels personally responsible for making a contribution to that.
Okay. So what makes a good leader as opposed to a bad leader?
Yes, I think that the truth is that a whole bouquet of competencies may do that. So if we look back, for example, at the top leaders in the democratic dispensation in South Africa, we had Nelson Mandela, who was in a certain sense a man for the moment. Essential that he could navigate this enormous amount of complexity, bring us from the past into the present, as it were. And of course, as futurists, we're curious about the nature of time and how leaders engage with time. Then we had Mr. Mbeki, who in a certain sense was, on the one hand, a bureaucrat, and on the other, a sort of philosophical intellectual about the nature and possibility of Africa. So the bureaucratic style of leadership often means that you try to introduce processes, and what processes give people is a sense of confidence and trust. And so in the financial markets, for example, people had an enormous amount of trust in Mbeki because he had this idea that things have to be managed professionally, if you like. Then we had Mr. Zuma, who was, in a sense, the kind of master political tactician. So if we consider the perspective of time on Mr. Zuma, he was a man, I think most would agree, who was oriented towards the past and used the past in a sense as his power base. And then he was also an extremely masterful tactician. But tactics is a very short-term way of thinking about the world. It's about ducking and diving, and some would say dodging in his case. And then we also had this kind of, many would argue, a kind of moral deficit in that president. Now we have a very interesting man, where we had the man for the moment, the bureaucrat on processes, a man really from the past and in a sense outdated. We now, and this is what excites us as futurists, have what I do believe is a man for the future. Mr. Ramaphosa has a number of very interesting qualities that makes him perfectly suited for where South Africa is at the moment. So if you look at his history, for example, he brings a diverse range of experiences. He was the founder of the National Union of Mine Workers. He was the organizer of the first conference of COSATU. So a strong labour environment, and we know that one of the key competencies of labour unions is an extremely highly developed ability to negotiate. And negotiation is very relevant to the leadership competence of influence. You could argue that if you don't have any influence, you are not a leader, despite what your title might suggest. Then Mr. Ramaphosa also brings extensive exposure to the business environment, with McDonald's, Coca-Cola, MTN, Bidvest, and a number of organizations, Lonman and so on. So that, in addition then to labor and business, he brings, of course, extensive experience in government. So we have here a very interesting man with exposure to labor, business, government, so very technically experienced, which I would say is another important requirement. But I think particularly interesting in the case of Mr. Ramaphosa is that he is a man for the long game. It is important to understand that he not only honed his negotiation skills in labour, but of course was the lead negotiator for the ANC in the South African national transition. He has negotiated, of course, a large number of business deals, and now played, really since 2014, a long game to become, as he now has, the President of South Africa. He comes also, of course, from the Mandela School. So for many of us, there's a kind of resonance between Mr. Mandela and Mr. Ramaphosa. And then he brings very much an international perspective on the world. Mr. Mandela was international in his orientation, but really lacked the international exposure, if we're allowed to be even partially critical of Mr. Mandela. Mr. Mbeki came from the international world, but really wanted to connect with his African roots. Mr. Zuma really was an African at heart. And now we have a man who brings an international experience. In leadership terms, we would say he brings a contextual intelligence. So Mr. Ramaphosa brings a whole host of what you might call the perfect storm of leadership competencies, and perhaps for that reason, we're all really quite optimistic.
Yes, and just to add to that, he was, of course, initially deputy chair, later chair of the National Planning Commission.
Indeed,
which
so.
implies, by its very nature, a long-term perspective.
Indeed, so.
I think he was also internationally recognized for his negotiating skills involved in an island a few years ago.
That's exactly right.
That.
And indeed in Kenya, he was a lead negotiator.
So I get from your story that you clearly think, and I would agree with you, that he is the right man for the moment, given the chance. What could prevent him, in his own personal makeup, from becoming this savior of the country? What can we say against him, if anything?
Well, I think we should always be careful about bestowing a kind of messianic character to any leader. And of course, as much as we are futurists and study the future, we all have a past. And Mr. Ramaphosa is no exception. And it is very unlikely that the opposition will let go of some of those elements from his past where perhaps, and occasionally by his own admission, he hasn't necessarily behaved in the right way. I think the most prominent one is what happened in Marikana. And having said that, though, that's also an important learning school. And I think Mr. Ramaphosa has, in a sense, also developed the kind of requisite humility required for effective leaders, having gone through that experience. And his response is notable, because he wasn't defensive. And in fact, he recognized that there were alternative ways in which he could have navigated that, which is a very rare quality in a leader.
I think it's probably also worthwhile reminding ourselves that, in a certain sense, he's not actually been elected as president.
Yes.
There's a big election obviously coming up next year, and one would imagine for the next few months, he might have to temper some of his long-term strategic objectives with a view to first ensuring a decent victory in the election. Looking beyond that, I get the sense that if we ask the question, so what? That we are saying, let's cross fingers and hold thumbs, and we might be seeing a leader and a leadership style that the country indeed needs and requires desperately to take us out of this bit of an abyss of not depression, but concern and economic sluggishness and political low levels of social capital, political capital. that maybe we're now on the right track, as long as you bear in mind, and you made a very interesting point that Mr. Zuma was a master tactician. Maybe we can say Mr. Ramaphosa is a master strategist with that long-term view. So the so what, the answer to the so question would be things looking better.
It's, as futurists, we are never fatalistic. We are always, as we say, activistic rather than atavistic. And indeed, in this case, it is our belief. I think Mr. Ramaphosa brings a bouquet of competencies that are rarely seen in a leader. He has respect internally in South Africa among a range of stakeholders, and he has the respect of the international community, and that, I think, positions us particularly well.
Well, I'm very happy. I think futures also need to be optimistic.
Indeed.
So thank you for that optimistic observation and optimistic tone. And we all, as I said, we all cross thumbs, hold fingers, and look forward to 10 years of, if not prosperity, a happier South Africa.
Indeed so.
Thank you, Morne.
Thank you, Andre. Lovely.
Yeah.